Hello and welcome to Crossing the 49th, the Cross-Border Tax and Financial Planning Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Hogan, and today we're going to talk about whether we need to file a W-8 or a W-9. Okay, so let's get started here. I get this question all the time. Now, we're going to talk about this in the context of maybe you might have an investment account, whether it's in the US, it might be in Canada, but you might have US investments in that investment account. And then likely you'll be asked by the broker or the investment advisor or the company to supply a W-8 or a W-9. So we get this question all the time. So we want to kind of clarify when you need to file a W-9 and a W-8. So first, let's take a look at these forms. So let's take a look first at form W-8. And this one will kind of play into whether you need to file a W-8 or a W-9 because there's a bunch of exemptions. So let's talk about this. Let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see. Okay, so here's the form that I'm sure many of you have seen before and you've been asked to complete. On the surface, it can look kind of overwhelming. But let's just walk through and let's look at the examples of when you may or may not need to file this form. So first thing you want to do, so what's this form called? It's called Certificate of Foreign Status of Beneficial Owner for United States Tax Withholding and Reporting. Well, that's a mouthful. Essentially what this form is doing, this form is a form that you complete and file, or you complete and send to the broker or your investment advisor, and they keep this on file. This is not a form that they send to the IRS. It's not a form that you send to the IRS. They just keep this on file, and they keep this on file so that they know what to withhold on certain levels of income. So for instance, if you receive income in the form of US dividends, they'll need to know to withhold 15%. But let's before we get to that, let's just go through the first part of this form. So do not use this form if you are not an individual. So there's a different form if you're a corporation, W8-BEN. Do not use this form if you're a U.S. citizen or other U.S. person, including a resident alien individual. So if you're a U.S. person or a green card holder or a resident, you're not going to file this form. And it shows right here, you need to file W-9. So that'll kind of lead into our conversation about W-9. You're a beneficial owner claiming that income is effectively connected with the conduct of trade or business in the U.S. W-8-EIC. You would need to file if you're a beneficial owner who's receiving compensation for personal services in the U.S., a different form. And if you're a person acting as an intermediary, there's a different form. So we're not going to get into those forms. But if any of those apply, the W8-BEN is not something you need to complete. Now, before we get into the details of the W8-BEN, W-9 is really, really straightforward. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at that form. So if we see here, and let's open up that form. So the W-9 will be, so for anybody, and let's make this a little bit bigger. So if you're a U.S. person, a U.S. citizen, or a green card holder, this is the form that you need to complete. So often U.S. citizens are sent the W-8 form because they might live in Canada. So you might be an American living in Canada, which most of our clients are, and somebody might send the W8-BEN to you and you might complete it. This happens all the time. That's not the form to complete. And unless you actually read the top of that form, you wouldn't know that because somebody's sending you this form. So if you're a U.S. citizen or a green card holder or a U.S. resident, tax resident, you should not be completing the W-8. You need to complete the W-9. And we're going to walk through the W-9 here because this is a really simple form to complete. If you're a U.S. citizen, green card holder, or a U.S. resident, this is the form you need to file if your broker sends you this request. So essentially, you'll report your name. If you're just an individual, there's no business name here. Click individual. None of these exemptions in most cases will apply and they won't be required. So you won't need to do anything with these exemptions unless somebody is asking. Address, city, state, which is in most cases going to be Canadian address for Americans living in Canada. And this is the most important part. This is the only thing they're really requiring here. They're just looking for a social insurance number or a social security number so that they know that you're a US citizen and they either do or do not need to withhold on US source income. Social security number, you certify that that information is correct. And it's right into the, yeah, there it is. So yeah, certified that this information is correct and you sign the form. So really easy. You're a US person, they just need to see your name, address, and your social security number. Now, assuming you are not a US person, you will need to file Form W8. So if we look at Form W8, go back to where we were originally. Okay, so now this form, once again, very, very common. If you're not a US person, you're going to file this form. So let's go back to why we're filing this form. You might be receiving dividends from US companies. So let's say you own Apple stock and it's paying you a dividend. Every time it pays you a dividend from the US to a Canadian resident, it needs to withhold a certain level of tax per the treaty. And we're not going to get into all the treaty sections here, but as we work through this file, I'll give you an example of how some of this can get completed. And I also get this question a lot. Do I need a tax accountant to help me with these forms? The W-9, likely not. I mean, it's just name, address. There's some FATCA information there that's often not applicable, and then you sign the form. So that likely don't need a cross-border account. Always a good idea to get that advice if you feel you need it. Nothing wrong with that at all. The W8-BEN can be a little tricky. Once again, what we're doing here is just for informational and educational purposes. I wouldn't attempt this form on your own. But this would be the form you probably want to get a little bit of help with. Shouldn't be that costly because it's not very, it's not a lot of work to get this form done. But as we walk through this, you'll see why some of the fields can be a little bit confusing. So assuming you're not a US person, we're going to have our name, country of citizenship. Let's say that's Canada at that point, mailing address, US tax identification number. In some cases, you actually might have a US tax ID. So you might even have a social security number if you renounced and you're no longer a US person. You might have an ITIN if for whatever, you might have a rental property down there that requires an ITIN. A lot of Canadians have US ID numbers, so you would put that information there. Your foreign tax identification number, which would be your Canadian tax ID number, which is your social insurance number. Most of these are not applicable, your date of birth. And this is the most important part. So outside of your name and your address, likely the most important part here, they need to see your foreign social insurance number, which is your Canadian number, and then your US ITIN if you have one. Date of birth is important, but this section here, part 2, is really important because what they're doing is they're asking you, why do you apply? Why would you have access to treaty benefits under certain sections? So once again, this is very often for US dividends. And we can walk through some other examples here after this, but let's assume that this is only for US dividends. We would have to complete this part here. I certified that the beneficial owner is a resident of Canada. So you're a tax resident of Canada, not of the US because you're not a US person, within the meaning of the income tax treaty between Canada and that country, or the United States and that country. So if we go here, let's take a look at the treaty really quickly. So if we look at the treaty, they're going to want us to, so this, for anybody that's really interested, here is a copy of the treaty on the Government of Canada's website. As we go through here, let's find, so it should be Article 10 will relate to US, to dividends paid to Canadian residents. Okay, so Article 10 here, dividends paid by a company which is a resident of a contracting state. So let's say that's Apple, which is a resident of the US, to a resident of the other contracting state, being Canada, may be taxed in the other state. So it goes through, there's a bunch of detail here, but at the end of the day, you should be paying, assuming it's not a control company, you're paying 15% tax on the dividend from Apple to you. You pay that 15% to the US government, the IRS. And when you file your tax return in Canada and you pay tax on that Apple dividend, you get to claim tax credit for the 15%. We're not going to get into FTCs or foreign tax credits in this video, but that's how that works. Okay, so let's go back to the W8 here. So if we assume that this request is for, and often there can be a request for W8 when you have rental income, business income, you might have, and dividends. So this, you would have to flush this out with an attachment to the W8. But let's assume this is only for U.S. dividends to a Canadian resident. I certify that the beneficial owner is a resident of Canada within the meaning of the treaty. Special rates and conditions. Now, often, I mean, in most cases, when people complete this, if they just put Canada, the broker will know what rate to withhold. But it's always good to kind of flush this whole section out. Special rates and condition. The beneficial owner is claiming a provision of articles and paragraphs. So that would be Article 10 of the treaty, and you can also you can reference the paragraph as well. Of the treaty identified on line 9 above to claim a 15% rate of withholding on dividend income. Now, once again, this gets a lot more complicated in the sense that you might have interest from U.S. sources that will be 0% within that account, and you might have other income. But this is, once again, just for educational purposes. Let's assume it's just dividends. So 15% on dividend income. And then you have an additional section down here to explain additional conditions of the article and paragraph for the beneficial owner. And you might do that in cases where you're earning business income from the U.S. and you're treaty protected as well. But we're not going to get into that today. Once that's completed, you want to read the certification, make sure that you really understand what you're signing. Sign, date, that goes right to your investment professional or the broker, and they will keep that on file and know what rates to withhold. Once again, they really just need to know which treaty applies to you. They keep this on record, and then they will record you as a Canadian resident. Therefore, you'll have 15% withholdings on dividends and 0% withholdings on interest, for example. Once again, this form does not get filed with the IRS. Neither does the W-9. They just keep this on record. So kind of a quick overview there. Because we get so many questions about W8s and W9s, I thought it'd be a good idea just to do this quick video for people, because we do see a lot of Americans filing W8-BENs incorrectly. But at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world because you're filing a U.S. tax return. You can make up the difference on the U.S. return when you're filing. But technically, you should only be filing a W9 if you're a U.S. person. And if you're a Canadian resident earning income from the U.S., in many forms, it's a W8-BEN. So I hope that was helpful. I'd love to hear any comments below, and anybody's having any experience with this. If they have any additional questions about the W8 or the W9, I do my best to try to answer every question in the comment. So thanks again for listening. We'll talk on the next one. Bye.